October 12, 1979, the wind that night did not simply howl, it tore. It clawed at the chimneys and ripped through the treeless moor like something alive. Morcant House stood in the middle of it, a gray-bricked orphanage with its slate roof rattling under the weight of the storm. Rain slammed against the windows in hard, uneven bursts, as if someone were knocking to be let in. Inside, the corridors were dim and warm, lit by the dull glow of wall sconces that flickered every time thunder rolled over the hills. At 9:17 p.m. The lights went out for a moment. The only sound was the storm. Then came a murmur from the dormitories, restless voices, the scrape of chair legs, the shuffle of slippered feet on old wood. Matron Elspeth Gray was seen crossing the hall, a shawl pulled tight around her narrow shoulders, moving toward the east wing. A nurse followed close behind, her face pale in the sudden dark. Somewhere deep in the building, a bell rang 3 short chimes. By midnight, the rain had eased. The wind still roamed the hills, but Morcant House lay unnaturally still. The morning sun, thin and reluctant, found the front doors ajar. Inside, the beds were neatly made, the shoes lined in perfect pairs. Bowls and spoons stood ready on the breakfast tables, but there was no one left to use them. 32 children, 4 members of staff, gone. No sign of forced entry, no footprints leading away across the soaked moor. Hours turned into days, days into months. The police scoured the bogs, the abandoned mines, the railway cuttings swallowed by gorse. Nothing. The storm had come and gone, but whatever happened inside Morcant House left no trace. For 22 years, the file sat gathering dust, the photographs of small faces staring out from yellowing pages. And then, in 2001, workmen renovating the old chapel tapped on a wall and heard the hollow echo of something hidden behind it. What they found would tear open the case in ways no one could have imagined. But on that night in 1979, all anyone knew was that a home full of children had simply vanished. Before the storm, Morcant House was not a place of misery, as outsiders might have imagined. It was a tall, square building, its stone weathered by decades of wind, standing like a stubborn sentinel against the rolling moors. Inside, the air often smelled faintly of yeast from the kitchen, where bread baked every morning under the careful eye of Mrs. Fenwick, a cook who hummed old folk songs while kneading dough. Children's laughter carried down the corridors in bursts, and though the floors creaked, the place felt lived in, worn in the way a wool sweater might be, frayed at the edges but warm. Matron Elspeth Gray had been there for 20 years. Tall and willowy, with silver hair always pinned in a tight bun, she moved with the quiet authority of someone who knew every creak of the staircase. Every child's cough from the sound alone. She wasn't one for sentiment in public, but the children trusted her. She remembered their birthdays, mended their socks by the fire, and kept a jar of barley sweets locked in her desk for particularly bad days. Her rules were strict: no shoes on the bed, no playing near the old well, but they were fair. Among the children was 9-year-old Thomas Bell, a boy with a shock of dark hair and an endless supply of questions. He could be found most afternoons perched on the stone wall outside, watching the sheep graze on the hills. Then there was Margaret Maggie Cole, 13, fiercely protective of the younger ones, often helping them with their reading in the glow of the lib rary lamp. In the evenings, the older children would sit on the wide staircase, listening to stories told by Mr. Latham, the only male staff member, who had a knack for turning even the driest history into something worth hearing. Daily life followed a steady rhythm. Mornings began with the ringing of the handbell at 7 sharp, followed by porridge in the long dining hall. Lessons filled the late morning: reading, sums, geography. Then came chores in the afternoon. The evenings were quieter, with homework at the long oak tables, then supper, then prayers in the chapel. By 8:30, the younger ones were in bed, the older ones by 9. Outside, the wind always seemed to be moving, but inside there was a sense of order, a sense that someone was looking out for them. Yet even in this routine there were details one might notice only in hindsight: the matron's habit of locking the east wing after dusk, the way Mr. Latham would stop mid-sentence if a certain name was mentioned. and the peculiar rule that no one, not even staff, was to go into the chapel alone after nightfall. At the time, these were just rules, easily accepted, barely questioned. But in the days leading up to that October night, those small, quiet restrictions would take on a different weight entirely. For the children of Morcant House, the week before the storm was like any other: lessons, chores, stories by the fire. None of them could have known it was the last week they would ever live within those walls. It began subtly, almost too subtly to notice. A slight change in how the staff moved about the halls. The matron, usually a steady presence, seemed distracted. She would pause in doorways, her eyes fixed on something unseen, as if listening for a sound no one else could hear. The cook, Mrs. Fenwick, stopped humming in the mornings. The bell that called the children in from the yard rang at odd times, sometimes twice in 1 hour, and always with a quick, urgent tone. Thomas Bell noticed first. One evening after supper, he saw Mr. Latham standing by the chapel door, turning a small brass key over in his palm. When Thomas asked what it was for, Mr. Latham smiled faintly, said it was for safekeeping, and tucked it into his coat. The boy thought nothing more of it then, but later he remembered how the man's hands trembled. The older children whispered at night, speaking of 3 rings and what they meant. Maggie Cole overheard 2 of the younger girls talking about a figure they'd seen in the courtyard just after sunset, tall, thin, wearing a wide brim. D-hat. No one could say where he came from or where he went. The matron brushed it off, telling them it was probably a passing shepherd. But the courtyard gate was always locked at dusk, and no one outside should have been able to get in. A week before the storm, the east wing was shut entirely. Curtains were drawn tight and the door was bolted from the inside. When asked why, the matron gave the same answer to everyone: renovations. But there were no workmen, no tools, no noise from behind those walls. At night, faint scraping sounds could be heard from that direction, followed by a soft tapping like knuckles rapping on wood. Even the smallest routines shifted. Lessons ended earlier and the children were kept indoors more often. On one occasion, a supply driver delivering flour to the kitchen heard the chapel bell ringing, though the door was locked and the building dark. When he mentioned it to Mrs. Fenwick, she went pale and told him he must have been hearing the wind, but the wind that day was still. These moments were brushed aside at the time, explained away with half-answers and gentle warnings. Yet each one left a faint mark, a quiet unease that settled over Morcant House like the first cold mist of autumn. In hindsight, they were not just oddities, they were the sound of something approaching, slow and certain, like footsteps on the other side of a locked door. The storm struck early in the evening, rolling over the moors like a black tide. By 7, the wind was strong enough to make the windows bow inward, and the rain came in sudden, violent bursts that rattled the panes. The power flickered twice before finally cutting out at 9:17. In that brief moment of darkness, the air seemed to thicken, as if the whole building was holding its breath. Margaret Cole was in the upstairs hallway, gathering the younger children from the playroom. She moved quickly, her voice calm but firm, urging them toward the dormitories. Thomas Bell lingered by the staircase, watching a thin ribbon of water slide down the wall from a crack in the ceiling. Lightning flashed, and for a split second the outline of someone tall, unmoving, appeared at the far end of the corridor. Then the hall was empty again. Downstairs, Matron Elspeth Gray crossed the main hall with her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, a brass key clutched in one hand. She was heading toward the chapel, her steps sharp and purposeful. A nurse, pale-faced and silent, followed close behind. No one knows what passed between them. The wind rose to a scream outside. The chapel bell rang 3 short chimes. Every child froze at the sound. It was not the usual tone, not the gentle call to evening prayers. This was clipped, urgent, a signal few seemed to understand but all seemed to feel. In the dining hall, chairs scraped back. Somewhere upstairs, a door slammed hard enough to echo through the building. The older boys gathered the smallest children, herding them quickly toward the east wing, though no one had been allowed there for days. Maggie was last to go, glancing once over her shoulder at the open front doors. Rain blew in, cold and sharp, though no one was standing there. By 9:30, the sounds inside the orphanage had faded. No footsteps, no voices, just the groan of the building under the weight of the wind. The storm pressed on for hours, lashing the moors in sheets of rain. When it finally eased, Morcant House was silent. The beds upstairs lay neat and untouched. The bowls for breakfast were laid out, waiting, and yet not a soul remained. The discovery came at first light. A postman named Harold Jennings, making his way across the moor in the pale, watery dawn, noticed the orphanage's front doors ajar. He called out as he stepped inside, expecting to find someone tidying after the storm, but his voice was swallowed by the silence. The beds were all made, the shoes lined in neat pairs, the breakfast tables set for a meal that would never be eaten. Harold backed out slowly, uneasy, and rode to the village to raise the alarm. By mid-morning, Constable Peter Halford and 2 other officers arrived, their boots tracking mud across the stone floors as they called the names of T. He, children and staff, no answer. The search began almost immediately, swelling in size as word spread. Villagers came with lanterns, farmers with their sheepdogs. The storm had left the ground waterlogged and treacherous, but they combed the bog paths, the old quarry pits, the winding lanes to the neighboring hamlets. Helicopters swept low over the moors, their blades churning the mist, while volunteers scoured the railway cutting and the banks of the river, swollen and brown with rain. Inside the house, investigators looked for any sign of struggle: overturned furniture, broken locks, blood, footprints, but found nothing. Everything was in perfect order, as though the occupants had simply stood up from their seats and walked away. The only oddity was a single child's shoeprint in the chapel doorway, facing inward, as though the wearer had been walking backward into the room. Rumors began within hours. Some claimed to have seen lanterns moving across the far moor during the storm, though no one could agree on the direction. Others whispered about old tunnels beneath the orphanage, remnants from the days when the building had been a manor house. A shepherd insisted he'd heard the chapel bell long after the storm had eased, even though the rope had been cut. The families of the children, few as they were, clung to the hope that they had been taken somewhere safe, perhaps evacuated in secret. But as the hours stretched into days, hope thinned. Searchers returned each evening soaked to the bone, their torches dimming in the fog, their voices hoarse from calling names into the empty wind. The moor gave nothing back, not a scrap of clothing, not a single sound. And the walls of Morcant House, standing gray and still, offered no answers at all. Weeks passed and the search turned into something heavier, slower. The initial rush of urgency gave way to the grinding weight of uncertainty. The moors had been combed so many times that the volunteers could walk the routes in darkness, each bog, each fence post etched into their minds. Nothing new appeared. The police began to shift from active search to investigation, their questions circling the same points, wearing them thin. False leads came and went like flares in the fog. A report from a woman in York claiming to have seen 2 of the children on a train fell apart when she admitted she had only glimpsed their faces in a newspaper beforehand. A pair of boots found in a drainage ditch turned out to belong to a farmhand who had lost them months earlier. Each glimmer of possibility ended the same way, in disappointment, in another note filed away with the word "inconclusive" stamped across it. The strain began to show. Constable Halford, once calm and deliberate, grew short-tempered, snapping at junior officers over small mistakes. Mrs. Fenwick stopped speaking to the press altogether, retreating to her sister's house in the next county. Even the villagers who had joined the search each day started to come less often, the pull of work and the slow erosion of hope keeping them away. Inside the orphanage, investigators pored over records. Some of the children had no birth certificates. Some had conflicting dates in their files: 2 birthdays for the same child, 2 surnames for another. Adoption papers were missing for several of those who had left in previous years, the gaps explained as clerical errors but never convincingly so. These details raised quiet suspicions, but without any living witness, they remained little more than shadows on paper. By the third month, the case felt frozen. The press had turned their attention elsewhere, the headlines shrinking to small columns buried deep inside the local paper. The last official search party disbanded after Christmas, their torches packed away, their maps folded and stored in drawers. The doors of Morcant House were locked, the windows shuttered. And the silence that settled over it was not the ordinary quiet of an empty building, it was the kind of silence that feels aware of itself, as if listening. The file remained open but without movement. The questions were still there, pressed into the damp pages, unanswered and unyielding. 32 children, 4 adults, gone, and no one could say whether they had walked willingly into the night or been taken by it. It was more than 2 decades later when the case stirred again. By 2001, Morcant House had stood empty for years, its roof sagging, windows clouded with grime. A property developer from Leeds bought the building, intending to convert it into luxury flats. Renovation crews arrived in the spring, their hammers and saws breaking a silence that had hung over the place for more than 20 years. One morning, a carpenter named Alan Price was working in the chapel. His task was simple: remove the decaying organ and replace the paneling along the east wall. The room smelled of dust and damp wood, and each plank he pried away groaned like it had been holding a secret. At first, he thought the uneven sound of his hammer was the old wall giving way in places. But when he struck one section of panel, the echo was different, hollow. Alan knelt, running his hand along the wood until he found a thin gap where the panel didn't quite meet the floor. He tapped again, hollow, definitely. He called for his foreman, and together they worked at the edge until the nails gave. The panel came away in a sudden, splintering crack. Behind it was not more wall but an opening. The space was narrow, lit only by the beam of Alan's flashlight. Dust swirled in the air, disturbed for the first time in decades. It was a room no larger than a pantry, its walls bare stone. Against one wall sat a small wooden table with a ledger on top, its pages curled and yellowed, beside it, a metal folding chair. And above that chair, built into the wall, was a rectangular pane of glass. When Alan leaned closer, he saw that the glass looked out, not to the outside world but into the children's dormitory. The view was one way, the kind used in police interrogation rooms. From this hidden space, someone could have watched the children without being seen. The foreman called the police. Within hours, the site was sealed off and the discovery was making its way up the chain of command. For years there had been nothing, no trace, no hint of where the children had gone. And now here was a secret room no one had ever mentioned, holding objects no one had accounted for. In that moment, the case that had lain cold for over 2 decades began to shift. This was not a relic of the building's past as a manor house. This was something else entirely, something that did not belong in a home for children. Something that perhaps had been waiting all this time to be found. As the afternoon faded into a gray-blue dusk, I found myself drawn back to the same trail where I'd first stumbled upon the rusted fragment of metal. The forest felt quieter now, as if it too was holding its breath. Each step crunched on frost-bitten leaves, and the faint scent of pine mixed with the dampness of the earth. I didn't have a clear plan, just a pull in my chest that told me to keep moving forward. Near the bend where the trees grew thinner, I noticed something I'd missed before. A low mound of earth, barely visible under the tangle of roots and moss. The ground there seemed wrong, uneven, almost like it had been disturbed decades ago and then forgot. My flashlight beam swept over it, catching on something pale in the soil. I knelt, brushing away the cold dirt with my gloves, and there it was, a small, cracked badge, its edges eaten by rust. The letters were almost unreadable, but I could make out part of a name and a faded emblem. My breath caught. This wasn't just a random piece of debris, this belonged to someone. For a long moment I just sat there, the wind whispering through the branches above. In my mind, I pictured the pilot, young, maybe in his early 20s, climbing into the cockpit on a bright morning in 1943, never imagining this would be his final flight. I wondered if anyone had ever truly looked for him or if time had simply swallowed his story whole. The cold began to seep through my coat, but I didn't move. Instead, I pressed the badge gently into my pocket, a quiet promise forming in my mind. This wasn't over, not yet. Somewhere out here, the rest of the truth was still waiting, and I intended to find it. 2 days later, I sat in the back corner of a small-town diner, the kind with creaky vinyl booths and a coffee pot that never seemed to empty. Across from me was an older man named Frank Holloway. He had the look of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors, weathered skin, hands rough from years of work. When I showed him the badge, his eyes didn't just widen, they softened like he'd been holding onto something for far too long. "I've seen that emblem before," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made me lean closer. "Back in the 70s, when I was with the Forestry Service, we came across wreckage deep in the woods. Couldn't reach it with the equipment we had back then, and after a while the higher-ups told us to forget about it." I could hear the low hum of the fridge behind the counter, the clink of dishes being stacked, everything else faded into the background. Frank went on, telling me about a patch of land locals called Dead Man's Hollow. "Not many folks go there. Place has a feeling to it," he said, pausing to sip his coffee. I thought about the badge in my pocket and the uneven ground I'd found. The pieces were starting to fit together, but not cleanly. Something about the way he spoke told me there was more, something he wasn't sure he should say. When we left the diner, the cold air slapped against my face, waking me fully. Frank stood by his truck for a moment, looking at me like he was deciding whether to trust me or not. Finally, he said, "If you really want to see it, be ready for what you'll find. Some things don't want to be dug up." Then he got in and drove away, leaving me with more questions than answers and a pull in my chest stronger than ever. The next morning, mist clung to the treetops as I followed Frank's directions. The road narrowed into a dirt track, then into little more than a trail. My boots sank into the damp earth, every step accompanied by the distant caw of crows. Dead Man's Hollow wasn't a name given lightly. There was a heaviness in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. After nearly an hour of walking, I saw it, a jagged shape swallowed by moss and creeping vines half buried in the ground. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. The twisted metal, the faded paint, it was the fuselage of a small aircraft. One wing was snapped clean off, lying several feet away, the smell of wet earth mixed with a faint tang of rust. Inside, the cabin was cramped and dark, sunlight streaming through shattered glass, papers brittle with age lay scattered across the floor. Most were unreadable, the ink long bled away by rain, but one envelope was wedged between the pilot's seat and the wall. My hands trembled as I pulled it free. On the front, in smudged handwriting, was a name, Margaret Kane. Before I could open it, a sound broke the silence, a branch snapping, footsteps moving just out of sight. My heart pounded as I turned, scanning the tree line. For a moment I thought I saw a shadow slip between the pines, then it was gone. The forest seemed to close in again, as if nothing had happened. I tucked the envelope into my jacket, knowing I'd found a piece of the truth, but also knowing that someone else was out here and they might not want. It uncovered, some questions were answered, but the truth still feels unfinished, like a photograph with its edges burned away. The hidden room explained part of the orphanage's disappearance, yet the names in that envelope, they raise even more mysteries. Who was protecting this secret for decades, and why does it feel like someone is still out there making sure it stays buried? Stories like this don't fade on their own, they live in whispers, in shadows, waiting for someone brave enough to follow them. If you've heard rumors, if you know a detail that's never been told, speak up. The past only stays hidden when no one dares to uncover it. If this mystery has kept you on edge, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what we uncover next. Share this story with someone who loves unraveling the impossible, and tell me in the comments, what do you think really happened to the orphanage? Your theory might just be the missing piece.